Well, welcome everybody to the Buddhist Society, and in particular, this series sponsored by the Buddhist Society and the Numata Foundation on Mahayana Buddhism. They're also in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Buddhist Society, and we have a very special guest tonight, Professor Shimoda. I should say, welcome professors, members of the Sangha, distinguished members of the audience, friends in the Dharma. And tonight we'll be starting the first of 3 talks, one tonight, and then the next one is on the 2nd of July, and then the 3rd. And we're talking on a particular theme of the Mahayana, of which these lectures are involved. But tonight's talk is understanding of the 3 treasures. I'm not going to take up a lot of time on saying anything about the content of the talk, but I would like to say something about our guest who's come from Japan to speak to us. He was born in 1957. He's a professor at Musahino University and Emeritus professor at the University of Tokyo, and has made pioneering contributions to the study of Buddhist scriptures in India. His research extends to the history of theories on Buddhist studies methodology. Buddhist studies methodology is a big thing nowadays, because of the internet and because of all these things. Everyone has access to Buddhist terms. They're used always slightly differently here and there, but they come back to the original Sanskrit language, Pali and so on. So it's a very important contribution to make. Scholars use these methodological ways of actually being able to work more deeply and go more deeply into things. And he's worked particularly on the Nirvana Sutra and the depth of humanistic scholarship in elucidating texts. I won't go on because there's a lot of it, but he's a most distinguished guest, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a great honor to have been invited to speak part of the Buddhist Society's 100th anniversary memorial lecture series on Mahayana Buddhism. And thank you very much for your kind introduction. Just over the 3 lectures this week and the next, I hope to offer a clear picture of how Mahayana Buddhist scriptures were formed and how Buddhist thought evolved alongside them. Through this, I aim to highlight the unique intellectual character of Mahayana Buddhism and its place in the broader history of human thought. Buddhism first appeared in India, as you know, around the 5th century BCE, and it has since developed over more than 200 years. As one of the world's great religious and philosophical traditions, it formed a distinctive way of thinking, one that is quite different, not only from Western traditions, but also from other strands of ancient thought. A major transformation occurred within Buddhism with the rise of what is known as Mahayana, literally, a great vehicle. This form of Buddhism spread widely across Asia and prompted new and profound reflections on life, wisdom, and liberation. Within India itself, Mahayana thought spurred philosophical developments that also shaped other Indian religious traditions. Since the 19th century, Western thinkers have gradually come to recognize that Indian traditions include serious philosophical inquiry. The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was among the first to point in this direction, and later scholars in the 20th century, such as Helmut von Grasenapp and Wilhelm Halfas, documented how deeply Indian and especially Mahayana Buddhist thought challenged earlier Western assumptions. The Japanese philosopher Toshihiko Izuzu, best known for his studies in Islamic and comparative philosophy, once remarked that it was in Mahayana Buddhism that philosophy in the Western world reached a level of quality and complexity. In China, for example, the development of Neo-Confucianism, one of the most influential schools of East Asian thought, was deeply shaped by Mahayana ideas, especially the Huayan school of Buddhism. Even in modern Chinese history, Mahayana Buddhist thought played a meaningful role. Around the time of 1911 revolution, which marked China's entry into modernity, key thinkers such as Liang Qiqiao and Zhang Taiyan found inspiration in a short but powerful Mahayana text called The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana. This scripture is based on the idea that all beings have a latent potential for awakening. A concept called Tathāgatagarbha was taken as a source of intellectual and spiritual strength, and even seen as a serious counterpart to Western philosophy. In this series of lectures, I will focus on how Mahayana Buddhism came into being in India and how its scriptures and thought developed over time. But before we dive into those topics, we needed to establish a common foundation. It has long been a shared understanding among Buddhists across different countries and historical periods that the heart of Buddhism lies in what are known as the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Put simply, these refer to the Buddha, the awakened one, most often understood as the historical figure Gautama, also known as Shakyamuni, who founded Buddhism. The Dharma, the truth he awakened to, and the teachings he shared to express that truth. The Sangha, the community of people who follow the Buddha's path and seek to embody his teachings in their lives. This traditional understanding is widely accepted, but among Buddhist scholars, both among Buddhist scholars and among ordinary practitioners today, it gives the impression of a straightforward sequence. First, the Buddha awakens to the truth. Next, he puts that truth into words as teachings. And then a community forms around him to practice those teachings. However, this simple linear view is not enough to explain the deeper development of Buddhist thought concerning the three treasures. In the long and rich history of Buddhism, how these three elements are understood and how they relate to each other has evolved in subtle and complex ways. This is because Buddhist teachings do not develop only from abstract theory or external authority. Rather, they grow out of a direct inner experience of truth. That is to say, Buddhist thought takes shape not only through reasoning, but through the personal transformative insight of practitioners themselves. To properly understand this process, we needed to look at how meanings rise from lived experience, from what happens within consciousness itself. This calls for a way of thinking that pays close attention to how things appear and take shape in human awareness. In philosophy, this approach is often called phenomenology, the careful study of experience as it is actually lived. In the next part of this lecture, I would like to explore how this kind of experiential approach can help us rethink the meaning of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, not just as historical facts or external categories, but as realities that unfold within the awareness of each person who encounters the Buddhist path. Let us now turn to a deeper question. How do the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, come to be experienced in the life of an individual? If we look not from a historical or doctrinal angle, but from the inner perspective of a person who encounters Buddhism, we can think of Buddhism as beginning at the moment when the idea of Buddhism starts to feel real in that person's consciousness. That is, when it starts to matter to them personally. But this doesn't happen in isolation. It only becomes possible because there is some living memory or presence of Buddhism kept alive in the community of Buddhists. From this experiential viewpoint, the journey doesn't begin with the Buddha himself or even with his teachings. Rather, it begins with the Sangha, the community of practitioners. It is through meeting a living Buddhist or encountering a tradition that has been passed down that one first learns of the Buddha and his teachings. In other words, both the Buddha and the Dharma, his truth and the teachings, are first encountered within the Sangha. This is the first stage in how the three treasures comes to be experienced. All three are present, but they are received through the Sangha, which holds the other two. The Sangha, however, does not point to itself. Through its way of life, its words and its example, the Sangha seeks to communicate something greater, the reality of the Buddha and the truth he awakened to. And those who are drawn to the Sangha begins to see that each member, though shaped by particular times and places, is striving toward something universal, something that transcends history. That is, the timeless wisdom of the Buddha and the Dharma. This leads us to the second stage. Here, the focus shifts from the Sangha to the deeper sources it represents. The Sangha is no longer just the starting point, but becomes the means through which the deeper treasures, the Buddha and the Dharma, are revealed. These two now appear together as a single unified reality. Both expresses the same ultimate truth, and both exist beyond the changing conditions of any one place or time. In short, what begins as a personal encounter with the Sangha unfolds into a recognition of something universal, the enduring presence of awakening, the Buddha, and the truth of the path, the Dharma. The Sangha remains vital, but it is now seen as a living bridge to these timeless treasures. At the third stage, a more reflective and critical awareness begins to emerge. The individual no longer sees the Buddha and the Dharma simply as a unified presence. Instead, a distinction is drawn between the two. On the one hand, there is the Buddha, the person who awakens to the truth and shares it with others. On the other, there is the Dharma, the truth itself, the content of that awakening, both as it lives within the Buddha and it is expressed through words and teachings. In this stage, the Buddha and the Dharma are no longer experienced as one and the same. They stand apart, can even appear to be in tension. We might say that This marks a new kind of dual perspective. The Buddha is now seen as a subject, a conscious being who has realized the processes, the truth, while the Dharma is seen as the object of that realization. The truth is that it's grasped, held, and then communicated to others. This distinction allows us to seek deeper questions. Is the truth something that belongs to the Buddha? Or is the Buddha's significance grounded in the truth he discovered? Meanwhile, the Sangha, the community of practitioners, continues to exist in real historical time. The Sangha is always made up of people shaped by particular cultures, languages, and moments in history. But the Buddha and the Dharma, as they come to be understood at this stage, represent something beyond those limitations. They are seen as universal, as pointing to something timeless and true, no matter where or when they are encountered. So, at this point, the relationship among the three treasures becomes more complex. The Sangha is the living link within history. The Buddha and the Dharma are the universals that transcend history. And now, Buddha and Dharma are recognized as distinct but deeply interrelated. One can say that the truth of the Dharma is made visible through the life of the Buddha, and at the same time that the Buddha's meaning depends on the reality of the Dharma he embodies. At this more developed stage of reflection, the structure of the three treasures in Buddhism may remind us in some ways of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. In Christianity, the Trinity expresses the relationship between God the Father, the transcendent source, Jesus the Son, who appears in history, and the Holy Spirit, the presence of God that connects and moves between them. In both traditions, we see a triadic structure that links the eternal with the historical and the universal with the particular. However, there is also a crucial difference. Christianity is a religion of revelation. It begins with a belief in a single, all-powerful God who created the world and revealed himself to humanity. The Trinity as formulated by theologians like St. Augustine, drawing on earlier thinkers such as Plotinus, represents the three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as united within the being of a transcendent God who exists beyond space and time. By contrast, Buddhism does not begin with the idea of an absolute creator God. Instead, the three treasures are not manifestations of a divine being outside the world. Rather, they represent a dynamic movement within human history and experience. The Buddha is a historical figure who awakens to a profound truth. The Dharma is that truth, both realized and taught. The Sangha is the community that preserves and practices it. Yeah, that entire system unfolds through the lives of people in specific places and times, yet points to something deeper and more universal. It is not revealed from above, but arises from within human experience. In this way, Buddhism offers a vision of awakening that is not grounded in divine revelation, but in the unfolding of insight, practice, and community across history. The three treasures are not only objects of faith, they are also processes that reveal how spiritual truth can take root in the world. In the tradition of Tathāgatagarbha thought, which will be the focus of my final lecture next week, the Buddha comes to be seen as the deep underlying source from which all the three treasures arise. In the later development of esoteric Buddhism, also known as Vajrayana, this idea takes an even more symbolic form. The appearance of primordial Buddha suggests a unification or inner convergence of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Yet, even in these advanced teachings, Buddhism does not introduce a single ultimate principle that stands above and beyond the three treasures, nothing like a creator God or transcendent being who governs all. This is a key point. It shows that while Buddhist thought allows for profound depth and symbolic richness, it remains grounded in a vision of awakening that unfolds within the world and within human experience, not from a source outside or above it. This distinction is crucial, not just for understanding the unique role of the three treasures in Buddhist thought, but also for appreciating a fundamental difference between Buddhist philosophy and the metaphysical traditions of the West. So far, we have approached the three treasures from the perspective of the individual experience. Let us now shift to a historical point of view. This change in perspective doesn't set aside what we have already discussed. Rather, it helps us understand how those inner experiences are embedded in the unfolding history of Buddhism. The most widely accepted academic explanation of the three treasures is often illustrated by a well-known text, the Satyasiti Shastra. This text represents a straightforward chronological account. First comes the birth of Shakyamuni Buddha. Then the Dharma arises as the truth he realizes and teaches. And finally, this Dharma is passed on to his disciples and preserved in the community, the Sangha, up to the present day. This kind of explanation treats each other of the three treasures as if they were clearly separate things, almost like fixed objects in the world. From this perspective, the Buddha is seen as a historical figure who lived and died. The Dharma as a body of teachings he left behind, and the Sangha as an organization that has survived him. It's a view rooted in what we might call naive realism, the assumption that things are just as they appear and can be neatly separated. But this way of thinking leads us to a problem. It implies a sharp break between the time when the Buddha was alive and the time after his death. Once the Buddha is no longer present, does Buddhism lose its foundation? If we rely too heavily on this linear model, it becomes difficult to see how Buddhism could have continued to develop as a living tradition. Yet, when we look more closely at the scriptures, especially early ones, we find that the relationship among the three treasures is not so neatly divided. Their role often overlap, and the historical continuity of Buddhism turns out to be far more integrated and dynamic than this rigid timeline suggests. To illustrate this, let us now turn to an example from Pali Canon, the earliest collection of Buddhist scriptures, still preserved in full. Here, we can begin to see how the three treasures interact in ways that challenge simple historical boundaries. Let us now look at the concrete example from early Buddhist scriptures, the Mahabharata. A section of the Vinaya Pitaka in the Pali Canon offers a telling portrayal of how the three treasures begin to unfold in the earliest phase of Buddhist history. The Vinaya, the collection of monastic rules, open not with a list of regulations, but with the scene of the Buddha's awakening. This is significant. It shows that the authority behind all the rules and the practices found in the monastic traditions is grounded not in external law, but in the Buddha's own enlightenment, in the sheer fact that an awakened person exists. For the Vinaya, the entirety of Buddhism is embodied in a way of life that stems from this awakening. In that sense, the whole historical unfolding of Buddhism begins here. At this starting point, the Buddha is depicted as dwelling silently in the experience of enlightenment. In this silence, we find that the Buddha treasures and the Dharma treasure existing together as a single undivided reality. The truth and the one who has realized it are one and the same. But the story soon shifts. A heavenly figure, Brahma, appears and urges the Buddha to share his insight with the world. The Buddha overcomes his initial hesitation and agrees to teach. This moment marks the beginning of a transformation. When the Buddha gives his first sermon, an event traditionally known as the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, something new happens. The Dharma separates itself from the Buddha. The truth that had existed solely within the Buddha is now expressed outwardly in words. From this moment on, the Buddha and the Dharma appear as two distinct yet related treasures. Moreover, the Dharma itself now reveals a dual nature. There is the realized Dharma, the direct personal experience of enlightenment that remains within the Buddha, and there is the taught Dharma, the teachings expressed in language meant for others to hear and understand. This outward-facing Dharma is directed specifically to those who would receive it, namely the Sangha. And in doing so, it creates the conditions for Sangha to come into being. In other words, when the Buddha teaches, the Dharma becomes the bridge that not only separates him from his realization, but also connects him to others. The Dharma treasures, by being spoken, give rise to the Sangha treasure, and at the same time make visible the Buddha treasure as the source of realization. In this way, the early Buddhist texts show that the three treasures were not merely laid out as abstract principles. They emerged through narrative and rational moment, through experience, communication, and community. Their development was a dynamic process that began right from the Buddha's awakening and first act of teaching. And after the Buddha's passing, what is called his parinirvana, the relationship among the three treasures becomes even more intricate. Without the living presence of Shakyamuni Buddha, new ways of understanding and embodying the Buddha treasure began to take shape. Over time, these developments formed three major patterns or configurations, each emphasizing one of the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha. Let us now first look at the configuration centered on the Buddha treasure. With the Buddha no longer physically present in this world, the Buddhist communities were confronted with a question: what now serves as the presence or continuation of the Buddha? According to early Buddhist texts, including non-Mahayana versions of the Nirvana Sutra, two responses emerged. First, there were the teachings and Dharma and the disciplinary codes, Vinaya, that the Buddha had established during his lifetime. These became authoritative guide for practice and conduct. Second, there were the stupas, monuments that housed the Buddha's relics. These served as a physical sites of devotion, reverence, and pilgrimage. These two elements, one, the teachings and the rules, and two, the relics enshrined in stupas, came to be function as stand-ins or extensions of the Buddha's presence. They reflect the two sides of what the Buddha treasures meant after his passing. On the one hand, the teachings represent the truth the Buddha had realized and passed on to others. On the other hand, the relics represent the person who had realized that truth, a subject who lived, perceived, and embodied the Dharma. In time, this distinction gave rise to an important doctrinal development. Buddhist thinkers began to speak of the Buddha's body in two ways. The Dharma body, Dharmakaya, refers to the Buddha as the embodiment of truth, the timeless spiritual content of enlightenment. The form body, Rupakaya, refers to the Buddha in physical form, as the historical figure who once walked the earth and whose relics remained after death. Both of these came to be understood as different expressions of the Buddha treasure. They reveal how the Buddha's presence continued to be experienced, not only through memory or reverence, but through structure of knowledge, embodiment, and sacred place. Now, let us turn to the second configuration of the three treasures, the one that places the Dharma treasure at its center. In this view, it is not the Buddha who gives rise to the Dharma, but rather the Dharma that gives rise to the Buddha. One of the clearest expressions of this perspective is found in a discourse from the Samyukta Nikaya, a foundational collection in the Pali Canon. There, the Buddha affirms the timeless validity of a principle called pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination. This principle is expressed in a simple but profound formula. When this exists, that exists. When this ceases, that ceases. It describes the deep interconnection and the conditionality of all the things. What is remarkable is that this law is not presented as something the Buddha invented. Rather, it is described as an eternal truth, a Dharma, that is true whether or not the Buddha appears in this world. The Buddha's role is to discover and awaken to this truth, not to create it. In this sense, the Buddha's very identity as awakened one is grounded in the prior and universal existence of the Dharma. This idea becomes even more prominent in Mahayana Buddhism. In the Prajnaparamita Sutras, texts that emphasize the perfection of wisdom, the Dharma is described as Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, and it is revered as a mother who gives birth to all Buddhas. In other words, the wisdom itself is what makes a Buddha possible. Similarly, in the Lotus Sutra, the Dharma is not merely one of the Buddha's teachings. It is portrayed as the very reason the Buddha appears in the world. The true Dharma, embodied in the scripture itself, is presented as the ultimate aim and essence of the Buddha's life and walk. These examples make clear that in the second configuration, the Buddha treasure is understood as being grounded in the Dharma treasure. The truth comes first. The Buddha is its discoverer and messenger. It is a shift in emphasis that invites us to see Buddhism not merely as a tradition based on a historical person, but as one founded on an enduring truth that transcends individual lives. The third configuration of the three treasures is one that is centered on the Sangha treasure, the community of Buddhist practitioners. This mode is in some ways the most intuitive to grasp. When Shakyamuni Buddha passed away, the Buddhist community faced a decisive moment. The Buddha treasure, as a living physical presence, was no longer in the world. At the same time, the task of preserving both the Buddha's memory and his teachings, the Dharma, was entrusted to the Sangha. This moment marked a turning point in the structure of the three treasures. From that point onward, both the Buddha and the Dharma were, at least externally, embodied and carried forward by the Sangha. In practical terms, the history of Buddhism became the history of the Sangha. Its counsels, its interpretations, its institutions, and its way of life. It was through the community that the presence of the Buddha and the truth of its teachings remained accessible in the world. But this does not mean that the Buddha and the Dharma treasures disappeared. Rather, as discussed earlier, they became internalized within the Sangha. The Sangha does not merely preserve teachings or transmit memories. It contains, as its very essence, both the living spirit of the Buddha and the truth of the Dharma. These are not lost in history, but continue to shape the identity and purpose of the community itself. In this way, the earlier configurations, those centered on the Buddha and the Dharma, are not abandoned. Instead, they are retained within the Sangha, functioning as the core element that defines its mission and character. Thus, in the historical development of Buddhism, the three treasures appear to radiate outward from the Sangha treasure. But a closer look shows that Sangha is not self-contained. It is, in fact, deeply rooted in the other two treasures. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha remain inseparable, each giving meanings and structure to others across both time and tradition. The intricate relationship we have explored between the Buddha, the directly realized Dharma, and the taught Dharma, and the Sangha form a foundational framework shared across the entire spectrum of Buddhist Tathāgatagarbha thought. This structure is not confined to one school or period. It is evident in a range of classical texts, as the Mahabhasha, Vibhasha Shastra, and etc. These texts reflect a shared understanding of how the three treasures function together to preserve and transmit the Dharma across time. Upon this shared foundation, Mahayana Buddhism introduces a striking development, the emergence of thought, a doctrine that takes place the three pleasures at the very heart of its philosophical and soteriological vision. One of the key texts in the development is the Mahayana Buddhist Sutra. This sutra offers a bold and distinctive view. Rather than treating the three treasures as separate, independent elements, it presents them as fundamentally unified. In this framework, the distinctions we have discussed are preserved, but they are understood as expressions of deeper unity. The Mahayana Nirvana Sutra unfolds this view in three stages of doctrinal development. At each stage, the figure of the Buddha remains central. However, through a gradual process of rethinking and negating earlier conceptions of the Buddha, the functions of the Dharma and the Sangha are brought forward and integrated more explicitly. This movement from distinction to unity represents a significant transformation in Buddhist thought, and it will be the focus of the third and final lecture today. In the series next week. So, in today's lecture, we began by examining the three treasures: the Buddha, Dharma, the Sangha. From huh? Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. Okay.
That's it. Conclusion. Yeah.
Just a moment. Yeah, thank you. From the perspective of individual experience, we begin from this perspective, and we then shift to a historical lens, exploring how their interrelationship evolved over time, particularly after the Buddha's passing. Finally, we arrived at a doctrinal reflection showing how Mahayana Buddhism reimagined the three treasures as unified expression of the path to awakening. Then we have now seen that the three treasures are not a static element of belief, but dynamic realities that take shape in response to lived experience, historical change, and evolving philosophical reflection. They are the framework through which Buddhism understands not only its origin, but also its transformation, and ongoing vitality. In the next lecture, we'll turn to the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism in ancient India and explore how this idea reshapes the understanding of the three treasures from within Mahayana tradition. Okay, I look forward to continuing this next journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That was a wonderful talk. Very, very interesting. You have to have a lot of thought over that. But are there any questions from the floor, or indeed from our audience online?
Thank you for your lecture, Professor Shimoda. You presented this historical perspective of how the three treasures changed over time, the relation between them. Do you see we are still seeing changes in how this relation is presented nowadays? Do you see there is still space for development?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think so. Yes. So, the three treasures relationship, the three treasures are essential to Buddhism, and the three are all transformative. The relationships are all transformative. So, Yes, but simply, yeah, this is a simple answer. This is okay. Or should I add something? Okay.
I'm interested in the fact that early on, in the sort of 50s and 60s, generally speaking, you know, Western people looking at Buddhism would look at it and compare it with the philosophy of people like Heidegger, Husserl, Whitehead, and so on. You know, nowadays I think they've sort of given up on that altogether, haven't they? Because Buddhism is seen as a standalone, well, philosophy, way of life, religion, everything mixed into one. And I don't think there's any people in the West feel any particular need to do that and interpret it through the lens of, you know, historical philosophy. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, it must be something that concerns people.
Yeah, that's a very important question, or it's a problem. So that's why I raised this point of view. So this kind of trend of Buddhist studies have been heavily inclined to the historical viewpoint. Yeah. So to take a historical viewpoint. Not from the interpretative or the humanistical approach. So these two approaches are not so mutually contradictory. So we need to incorporate these two perspectives more to make the conversation between the West and the East much richer. Yeah. So, and it seems to me now that it's time to start. Yes, and the younger generations are interested in taking this kind of interpretative approach, hermeneutical approach, step by step.
Are there any other questions?
Sorry, I'm still trying to form the question in my mind, but in Mahayana Buddhism, and particularly in China and Japan, I suppose, the doctrine of Mappo, the degeneration of the Dharma, came into prominence over time. The further we are away from the Buddha's lifetime, the more the Dharma becomes diluted and lost, and the teachings eventually become extinct. And I was wondering how that doctrine, does it fit in with any one of those worldviews, any of those views about the three treasures which you've very clearly described in your talk?
Yeah, thank you for raising this important point of view. That's kind of eschatology. It had a huge influence in creating Buddhist thought. But at the same time, even in any kind of timeline, three treasures exist there. So, as in the age of Mappo, or the appearance of the three treasures drastically change, but still there, yeah. And in a way to best fit to the devastated situation. yeah, this is my answer.
I suppose it's something to do with the realization of mind. You know, once you realize that mind produces these things, and then you have to deal with that, you know, but it's really from mind, or the discovery of mind, which initially isn't, you know, described particularly. But the Mahayana, actually, that's what the work of the Mahayana is a description and topology of mind and its functions. You know, we look forward very much to your next lecture. But I think now we have to, because our online audience has to go.
Next lecture is, the subject is how Mahayana arose. That's very important point. It's the center of the main subject is study. Now, it will be very, very interesting.
Yes. Well, we're all looking forward to seeing, if you're still online and you haven't been switched off yet, look forward to seeing you next week with our next talk. And thank you all, audience too, very much for coming. And Professor Shimoda.
Thank you. Thank you so
very
much.
We eagerly look forward to your next talk.
Thank you very much.